Thank you, Mike. And I'm sure the coders in the audience will concur with what Gerry has said, that we do need better engagement between coders and clinicians. And I think certainly a theme for today in the conference is around the whole kind of engagement and stakeholder engagement with all the various players within the process. But I'd like to thank Mike for his support today, but also he's been very good to deal with over the COVID piece and the private hospital piece. So I look forward to continued engagement with Mike. So we move on to Dr. Gerry McCarthy, who has been very supportive of ABF, and particularly in relation to the ED and the pilot that we've done in relation to collecting activity using ICD-10 shortlist in Tullamore. So Gerry will present to us on that. Gerry.
Thanks very much, Brian. Thank you. I will try to distract you while I subtly continue the microphone on its downward course. The previous two speakers were done in order of ascending height today. Thanks very much, Brian. Thanks for the introduction, and thanks for the opportunity to speak. There is what I'm going to speak about, and hopefully this is going to work. Okay, so I just want to spend the first 4 or 5 slides talking about emergency departments. They're always in the news. They're always in crisis. It always sounds like it's the worst possible place that a person could end up until they do. I'm fascinated how many of my neighbours say, I was in your place the other day, geez, I got great treatment. And I kind of go, what do you expect? So a lot of that goes on underneath the radar. What do emergency departments need for activity-based funding? How we achieved, and I'm delighted to see Rob Eager, I'll mention him again in a moment, because he arrived here today, consultant colleague of mine in Tullamore. So how we achieved ICD-10 coding and why that mattered in one emergency department. What the HPO did with the data then, Emer Gallagher over here did magic stuff with it, and what our next steps are. So really I want to just talk about emergency departments for a few minutes. Then I want to talk about the journey towards activity-based funding. So there you are, that's where I work. That's what it looks like to everybody on the outside. Obviously when I'm in there, it's a humming, smooth machine, and there is a priority to all patient attendances and all that kind of thing. But as we know, it's the stuck part of the system. It's the eye of the storm. It's where people end up far too long. We know that's not bad for them. So really what I'd like the emergency department to be is the hot part of the unscheduled integrated care journey of the patient. So most of it happens outside the hospital. Most of it happens in the outside the emergency department. But when you end in with us, you get prompt professional assessment, and activity-based funding is going to help us in achieving that. So here's the dream of Sláinte Care. Keep as much care, leftward shift, top left there we can see self-care, top right we can see keeping it in primary care and community, and in the middle we can see, yes, that is me in the back of a van. It's a long story, I wasn't a prisoner. But that is, sometimes we have to bring the hospital to the patient in a hurry, so we bring the resuscitation to the patient rather than the patient to the resuscitation because it's so urgent. How we're going to fund all that is an interesting challenge, but I'm sure it'll work. So that's what emergency departments kind of do. Emergency medicine is the specialty that I practice. I practice most of it in the emergency department, but if one of you falls down there in front of us, I'd ring somebody. No, hopefully I would have some idea what to do. So here's where we do it. 28 emergency departments in the island of Ireland. There was until recently 29. 2 of them are paediatric only emergency departments in the Dublin area, and the bottom one there, the 24/7 paediatric emergency unit, is the one in Tala. The 12/7 paediatric urgent care centre is the one in Connolly, so recently opened as part of Children's Hospital Ireland, which is progressing at pace towards something that we call emergency care networks. And then there's one 12/7 emergency unit, which is the unit in St. Michael's Hospital in Dunleary, and that's a breakout of the Dublin situation. So how much do we do? Well, something that we know clearly is we do, or we see, or we deal with 1.3 million patient attendances per year. Not necessarily 1.3 million patients, because some of them come more than once, but 1.3 million episodes of care. 0.3 million of them are admitted, and we know quite a bit about those. What Mike did keep a secret actually is there is a 6-week course in medical school where we unlearn how to write. It's write in a language that only you can read. And that's what it says. 0.3 million are admitted, and we know a lot about them. 0.3 million are children. We know no more about them than we do about adults. So in terms of the diagnosis, there's the 0.3 million who go through the HYPE coding process. What that means is 1 million don't. Now, currently, we're journeying towards increasing senior decision makers, bringing them forward in the patient assessment so that we send more patients home. We know that earlier senior clinical decisions results in a drop in admission rate, but we're actually driving people who we already know their diagnosis into a bunch that we don't know their diagnosis. So that's why ICD-10 coding is much more important than activity-based funding in emergency departments. No, it was really key to achieve that, but we're going to achieve so much more than just activity-based funding out of achieving ICD-10 coding. We're going to achieve data for audit, research, know what we do, what our activity is. Funding, here's how much it costs you to do that. We think, we don't know. The porter's budget is, in one hospital, it's in central portering, in another hospital, it's emergency department. So if we are to move forward in the way that we as the emergency medicine program want to, which is to have a certain number of properly staffed 24/7 emergency departments supported by other satellite units for people with less acute illness, activity-based funding is essential for that. This is just something I put up there because I never waste an opportunity. Is Mary Flynn in the audience, our program manager? There's Mary Flynn. She'd kill me if I didn't show this slide. So EDAP is Emergency Department Activity Profile. It's something that we have developed to give each department visibility of their own data. The top left figure this is a hospital that shall remain nameless down in Cork. What yesterday's non-admitted patient experience time was. We're using that as a surrogate measure of the functionality of the system. So we all talk about patients on trolleys. What they really are is a measure of how few beds there are in the system. Whereas the non-admitted PET, how rapidly and expertly we see, assess, treat and discharge the patients who don't get admitted is a key figure of functionality. So what we're doing there is we're giving people visibility of what their workload is. Now there's obviously that's just one screenshot, that's the profile page, there's an awful lot behind it. What their workload is, in other words, the patients coming in, how old they are, what kind of things are wrong with them, what their throughput ability is, in other words, how many cubicles they have, how many staff they have, how many supporting specialties and all that kind of thing, and then their output and where the patients go. I won't say any more about it because I'll run out of time. So how do we do all that? Magic. So that is the processing of your typical emergency physician or nurse there. I'm going to stop now. I won't let you read it, but what we have to do is assimilate a whole load of data really fast, say, do we have enough to make a decision? What's the risk tolerance involved in this decision? And then move the patient on. What we don't like is the patient getting stuck in the emergency department. So enough about that. I'll now move on to activity-based funding. This is a direct cut and paste from a document you'll recognize. Stephen, I think you're one of the authors of it. This is what activity-based funding is all about. Mike has already spoken about the need for efficiency and to fund the activity where it happens. We would feel very strongly that if we are doing the work in the emergency department, we might as well get paid for it. If you want to successfully move the work elsewhere, we totally support you in that and leave us with the most seriously ill and injured patients. So, what did we do about it? Way back, 2016, we started discussions with the then National Clinical Advisor and Group Lead and now Chief Clinical Officer, Colm Henry, that we feel that activity-based funding should be introduced into the emergency department. Like so many others, he supported us, saying it makes sense, but I've no idea how we're going to achieve it. So we went over to the Healthcare Pricing Office and started to work very closely with Brian and Emer and FIACRA and all those people that I've got to know for far longer than I thought I would be knowing them at the start of this journey. We set up a subgroup. Next slide will show you which jurisdictions we looked at. We looked at different international models of funding emergency care. We settled on the Australian model with it was very clear to us as emergency clinicians that it seemed to make most sense, and it just happened to fit in with previous working relationships that the Healthcare Pricing Office had. But for obvious reason, it's the right thing to do. What was very clear, and I'll show it in a couple of slides now, is we needed to achieve ICD-10, International Classification for Disease, coding of the 1 million patients that we discharge without knowing what's wrong with them in order to achieve activity-based funding. Dr. Rob Eager, I mentioned earlier, consultant in emergency medicine in Midland Regional Hospital, Tullamore, always eager by name and by nature. Sorry, Rob, I'm sure I'm not the first to say that. About looking at systems and improving things. And he contacted me with an absolute genius idea, which was there was funding available for Aspire Fellows. That is, people who have, during COVID, people who used to previously go abroad after completing higher specialist training to become a consultant were stuck in the country. So there was funding made available for fellowships for those people who are already cooked, if you like, as a consultant, but don't have a consultant post yet and want to do something additional. So the idea was that we would appoint an Aspire Fellow who would spend his clinical time in Tullamore and work with the emergency medicine programme under Rob's supervision to achieve ICD-10 coding, travel that journey in Tullamore, which would allow us submit the data to the Healthcare Pricing Office to allow them do the due diligence, which we'll see what it was they had to do in a few minutes now, to assure the system that activity-based funding, as practiced in the Australian model, will translate successfully to the Irish. Dr. Tom McMahon was the Aspire Fellow. I don't know if Tom is in the audience. He may actually be seeing patients. But I'd like to acknowledge that Rob's brilliant idea led us to achieving the appointment of a fantastic guy who really took this on and worked very closely with the Healthcare Pricing Office. And then at the end, we'll mention what the next steps are. So I said we did an international review. At this point, I must acknowledge Emer Gallagher, who contacted me yesterday and just gave me her slides. So the rest of these slides are the talk that Emer should really be giving and gave a few weeks ago at a webinar. So the international review that we did, they're the countries we looked at, and Australia was just clearly head and shoulders the one that was going to work. What did we understand we needed? Well, the way the Australians do it, and I'm aware that I'm being followed by Joanne, who knows exactly how they do it. I'm just kind of reading it on a page. The reason that we chose it was because it had been in place for years. There was very strong working relationship. I met Australian teams a couple of years ago, and they were so generous in giving off their time and expertise. It aligned to the already existing diagnosis-related groups, and free expertise were good at taking that. Now, we also had the ED shortlist, so ICD-10 code has 12,000 diagnoses in it, I'm not sure. In the emergency department, obviously, we don't see chronic long-term conditions, or ideally don't see them. So there is an ED shortlist of about 1,100 conditions that we were given free access to. This is what we do in Australia, this is what we find works, and will it work in Ireland? The URG grouper, we'll look at that now in a minute. So URGs are urgency-related groups. My understanding is these are the pockets of work or activity that will generate funding. They're not all the same, they're not the same diagnoses, but they have been successfully bunched into this, it's similar levels of activity. I'm open to correction on that if that is not the case. So that's the holy grail that we needed to achieve, and we needed 5 pieces of data about each patient in order to achieve that. We needed, so this is templating the Australian model onto the Irish one, if you like. We needed the episode end status. I'll show you a slide about that now in a minute. We needed the type of visit. We needed the triage category, and I don't have a slide on it. Emer had one, but it's quite obvious that the triage categorization in Australia maps directly to the triage categorization in Ireland. I will have results in a moment. Sex, we didn't need to do much with it, you know. And the exit diagnosis code was the bit that we were missing in the vast majority of our patients. So that was absolutely the bit that we needed to achieve in order to go for the next steps in activity-based funding in emergency departments. So episode end status mapping, which is the first one there on the left. We sat down and we looked. On the left is what they use in Australia. On the right is what we had in Ireland, which is the PET. You may be familiar, the PET, patient experience time. Every hospital returns data to the business information unit every day about their PET, and there's maybe 15 or 16 data points, and they're coded already. This was a system already long existence in Ireland. So we sat down and we said, well, admitted to this hospital translates into 28, you can see it on the right there, I won't read it. But, you know, it's the same stuff happens to patients, we just call it slightly different things. So that's how we looked at episode end status mapping. Type of visit mapping, again, there's 9 different ones reported in Australia. We weren't really sure what a pre-arranged admission coming through the emergency department was, but we may learn in time as we go on. But we took what we knew existed from the patient experience time data. Number 1 new, number 3 unscheduled return is the same as an emergency presentation. So we had, sorry, there was somebody, I wasn't sure what I was being said, stand away from the mic. Okay, is that okay now? Thank you. So back to Tom McMahon's appointment in Tullamore, the Aspire Fellow, and under Rob Eager's guidance, they sat down and said, what is it we need to do? Where is it we're doing it? There was a lot of work required with IPIMS, which is the patient administration system in Tullamore and in the vast majority of hospitals in Ireland, in order to achieve agile, it might be the word I'd use, ICD-10 coding, and then training of staff. On the right there, we can see some of the crib sheets that Rob developed, Rob and Tom, in order to assist staff in what could easily be perceived as a new job. I never had to do this before, I'm too busy, it'll never work. And I think in trying to achieve ICD-10 coding in many, like I'm several years standing up at international annual conferences of the Irish Association of Emergency Medicine saying, we'd love a few of you to sign up to do this. And people would say, yeah, we'll do it. Then they'd go and speak to people in their hostel and be told, we don't believe you're going to do it, so we're not going to upload the coding. There's no incentive to do it because funding isn't here. So we were kind of stuck in how to move this forward. And that's where Rob and Tom came to the rescue. So they ran a pilot from the 21st September 2021 to 23rd of April, 31 weeks. We just decided to stop it when we felt we had maxed out on trying to get people to apply ICD-10 coding through all the various ways you try and get people to do something that they don't see the point in it. Cajoling, reporting, all that kind of stuff. I said, Tom, stop banging your head against a brick wall. We have enough. At this stage, Emer was working in parallel and coming back saying, yeah, we're getting this stuff and it's working. So there was no point in going any further. So I'm absolutely confident that the 61% compliance with ICD-10 coding will only increase once ABF becomes a real thing in emergency departments. The reasons are locum staff, changes of junior doctors, too few computers, all sorts of stuff that can be fixed. But the actual process of doing it, and Tom very diligently ran all sorts of surveys on staff users as to how was it, how did you find it, would you keep doing it. I don't have all the data here, but it was generally hugely positive, and I'm certainly very happy that the people using it just didn't see any great barrier and would happily continue to use it if there was a reason to use it. I think that's the really important thing. You know, if the hospital is encouraging people to use it by supplying sufficient computer terminals that are open and all that kind of thing, because there's a reason, the reason being activity-based funding. But an additional result from that reason is the amount of data we will generate to understand what it is we do and how we could do it better. And comparing different units will just be phenomenal. So you can see there the different stages and what goes on, and in the middle, black arrow, PET expanded to include diagnosis. That's all, you know, it was a lot of work to do it, but that was the extra data point. And then it went to the magic box of the HPO and Emer and co, and they did their work and started coming back. And Fiacre, you were particularly positive, I think, at an early stage, saying this is working. And we were looking for stuff. So the figures on the right there assure me that we're doing right stuff. 21% admission rate at the top there is in or around what you'd expect in a department like Tullamore. I don't want to comment too much on any one individual department's data, but all that stuff looks about what we kind of knew was there. So the discharge destination mapped onto episode end status was working. Pilot data, 97.4. So basically, let's take the bottom figure. Return patients who are not unscheduled returns are patients who have something that needs review in a week or two. So they get a scheduled review clinic, as we call it. And 2.6% is actually a low enough number. We would regard that as highly efficient, that the patients are dealt with properly on their first visit. But there is a number in or around a few percent, less than 5%, who would need to come back to a review clinic. So again, that's just assuring us that the data was correct. These are the triage categories. Triage category 1 is a little bit lower than would typically be the case. These are triage category 1 and 2. For those of you who don't know, when a patient comes into an emergency department, unless we stream them to another unit, I heard Gary Courtney's here, I don't know, Gary, the lead for the acute medicine program. Hi, Gary. So work that we're doing in parallel is the acute floor, where if a patient clearly needs to go to another, if their need is clear, we will stream them to another unit. We would, in the fullness of time, hope not to have to triage every single patient who comes, but rather just stream them at the point of arrival, that they would go to another unit or go straight to an advanced nurse practitioner or something. But currently we triage everybody. Triage is a very well-validated system internationally that allows us to assign an urgency of need of clinical intervention. So it's not a measure of sickness. If somebody is at a very advanced stage of terminal cancer, they're very sick, but they may not get an urgent triage category because there is nothing we can do in the emergency department to make them any less sick. But if someone comes in with a chemical burn to the eye, we will triage them as very urgent, and we will sort it out, and we will discharge them fairly smartly in the hope that we have prevented blindness. So triage is about what's the proximate problem and how urgently do we need to intervene clinically. So those triage categorizations would be fairly typical, except triage 1 would be lower than we would anticipate. And I suspect that's because you're too busy dealing with triage 1, which is the most immediately the patient who absolutely needs every resource you have available for the first period of assessment and treatment, that most of those patients would be admitted and there was no ICD-10 code assigned. So I think a lot of the triage ones were in the ones that weren't coded, would be a surmise on my part. So we looked at the top 10 diagnosis codes. There's another slide coming up in about 2 or 3 slides' time, which is the URG codes. So the diagnosis code is an essential component of coming up with the URG, but the URG is absolutely where we need to get to for activity-based funding. Does that make sense? So what this slide shows me is, as I would have expected, there is a wide range of diagnoses, and they're not all bunched into chest, abdomen, arm, and leg. So it does show me that people did use a sophisticated approach, that we used 67% of the 1,136 codes available on the ED shortlist. I think that shows a very good spread, and I think, Fiacre, you were very early in saying that that's a good spread. You wouldn't expect 100% of diagnoses in an incomplete patient sample in a short period of time. Some of those diagnoses are very important but very rare presentations. And also, Tullamore doesn't have inpatient pediatrics, so there will be a skew away from pediatric medical diagnoses and things like that. So that showed us the top 20 diagnosis codes. And the assurance we were given is that when we went through the URG stuff, MRHT data grouped to 98 out of a possible 114 URGs. And as I say, these are Emer's slides, and she knows this stuff. And she said that that's consistent with the cohort of patients presenting to MRHT. Voila, QED and all that kind of stuff. So these are the URGs. So if you look at the slide we looked at about diagnosis, that's one thing. But then you map all the other bits and you come up with a URG. So it looks just a little bit different. The percentages are a bit different because they're not the same thing. They incorporate diagnoses to come up with a URG. I know, oops, still standing, nothing burning. I know from being told that Joanne is going to speak about a kind of updating of URGs, which will include a couple of data points that we can extract from PET. So in typical Irish fashion, we're going to watch and see how it goes and see how we get on after that. So these are the URGs. I'm absolutely delighted that we got to this point. And like the excited child in the back of the family car on holidays, I said, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? And Fiacre said, not quite. We now need to look at costing. So we have, that's the summary of the data. I'm not going to reread it for you, but it's pretty good. We have gone and said, this works. We can generate the URGs. The Irish patients presenting to emergency departments, yeah, we can use the same system. We now need to know how that, the other side of ABF, which I understand is costing. We have gone through various different, arrived at a point where I approached my colleagues in different hospitals, and we'll show you the hospitals now in a moment. There they are. Because they seem to know stuff about patient level costing in the hospital, and because my colleagues in the front end, the emergency department, will be up for this. So we're now looking at going through, is the phrase a shadow period of ABF or something else? That'll do, will it? In those units to take us to the next step, which is to incorporate costing in it. There is a fourth hospital there that I won't say now, just in case the manager is here and she hasn't heard yet. So, sorry, that's it, yeah. So, next steps. Running in parallel, those units, shadow period, that's the correct phrase. Do the same stuff as we've done in Tullamore, and there's huge amounts of learning about how to do it, what to expect in terms of impediments to it, and you know, we're going to bring those to these other sites. Factor in the costing bit, and then I get to say again in a few months' time, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Are we there yet? And I think we're heading towards a target of the end of 2023, or maybe we can blame COVID and go into 2024. But I hope I'm convincing you guys that this pilot in MRHT has been a huge step forward in the journey towards activity-based funding in emergency departments. There we go. End of talk. Thank you for listening.